And it's the end of the month, which means it's time for another Incus release. This time around, we're looking at Incus 6.16 for the month of August 2025. I'm Stefan Graeber. I'm the project leader for Linux containers and one of the maintainers of Incus. So, what's new in Incus 6.16? It's not a particularly busy release in the amount of new features, but it's got some very welcome, kind of long time coming type of features in there, which should please a bunch of different users. So let's take a look. The first big feature is support for TrueNAS as a storage driver. So that is quite different from what you might have seen before with Incus itself being used on TrueNAS. So TrueNAS 2504 and up is using Incus to run virtual machines. So I've done some videos on that. It's effectively using Incus under the behind the hood to handle virtual machine and container creation. What we have here is a different beast. What we have here is the ability to run Incus on a regular server or regular VM, and then have it consume the storage from a TrueNAS server running somewhere else on the network. One of the examples for that would be you can run a properly fully redundant storage appliance from TrueNAS and then run an Incus cluster on like 3 other community servers or machines, and then have them use TrueNAS for storage, providing you with cluster-wide storage that can be used for instant live migration and the like. The way this is done is Incus effectively talks to TrueNAS through its API to remotely create the datasets, the volumes, all that kind of stuff, instead of doing it locally on ZFS. And then once the volumes are created on the TrueNAS side, they get exported over the network using iSCSI over to the machine actually running the instances. So that's for that new storage driver. One thing that's worth mentioning is that this currently requires the pre-release version of TrueNAS. That version is going to go stable in October this year. I believe it's TrueNAS 2510 Godai or something like that. So that's gonna be coming soon. You can obviously download and use the pre-release versions of TrueNAS. This works fine with them. But for running that in production, you're gonna want to wait till October. The next one is technically more of a bug fix than a new feature, but the bug fix is significant enough to mention it as a new feature effectively. So people pretty often now run Windows on top of Incus, running it inside of a VM. And to do that, well, you need to install Windows. And one issue that people often run into is that the Windows ISOs don't include the drivers needed to access any of the storage that Incus can expose. And that's a bit of a problem to actually go through the installation. So we have instead added a command to distro builder that can take a Windows ISO and repacks it with the right drivers pre-installed. That works, but that's not always really an option. There's a bunch of environments, especially corporate environments, where you really don't want to be mangling ISOs. You need to install the one that's provided to you by your IT department. So what we've been wanting to do for a while, and that was kind of the reason for adding the USB bus to disk devices back in the days, was being able to just attach the CD-ROM, the ISOs, so as a virtual CD-ROM drive on the USB bus, which Windows would then support during installation. It can grab more drivers from that and can install Windows correctly. That's not really worked out because while QEMU correctly detects ISOs and does the right set of properties in many cases, it did not for in the USB case. That effectively meant that a ISO would always show up as a read-only USB stick, not as a CD-ROM. And because Windows is a bit picky about it, if its installation media doesn't look like a CD-ROM, it doesn't detect it. So we finally find a way around that. A bit of trickery within QEMU, different type of devices, and a bunch of different things to do. But we finally have the right result, which is if you attach an ISO to Incus 6.16 and put it on the USB bus, it shows up as a CD-ROM drive, not as a USB stick. Windows is happy. You can go through the installation with a completely unmodified ISO now. So that's going to be very convenient for quite a few people. And then we've got a feature that was mostly meant for OCI container users, even though I'm going to be showing it later with the normal system containers. But basically with OCI containers, you don't really have an init system, you don't really have an etcfs tab that you can use to mark specific paths as being just memory file system, so tmpfs, and other paths being different mounts. So that's a bit of an issue in some cases for like containers that do require temporary space. Also, we noticed that Docker supports a bit of a hybrid where you can set a path as effectively, I want to still see what's in that path, but I want any changes to be stored in a tmpfs so that when the container restarts, you get a clean environment again. We've now added support for both, so that special disk devices within Incus, source equals tmpfs, source equals tmpfs-overlay. And with those, you can set their size, you can set what you want as well as the initial user group and permissions. And then Incus will have the container start with those pre-attached instead of having to go through the FS tab or similar mechanisms within the container. And lastly, we just expanded a bit the CLI configuration options. That's still pretty hidden. Right now, you need to directly go and modify the CLI config file if you want to do any of those kind of changes. As we add more, we're probably going to add a CLI around it so it's easier to go look at the settings and change them. But we basically added two new config keys, one to change what the default console type should be. By default, it's the text console. Now you can set it to VGA if you prefer. Obviously, VGA doesn't exist with containers, so it mostly works if you're primarily running VMs. And still for VMs, we now have a configurable console command for Spice VMs. So if you don't want our default logic of attempting to use believe remote viewer first and then falling back to Spicy, you can go and set the command that you want, and there's a variable socket in all caps that's then replaced with the actual socket path when we run the command. And that's it for this release. So as mentioned, not a lot of features, but some pretty big ones that we're very happy to see in there. There's also quite a long list of bug fixes. So that's the other thing. We fixed a bunch of issues and affecting kind of variety of things. Like we fixed, TPM on ARM64. We fixed a bunch of cluster communication issues, handling of proxies, tweaks to compression during refresh transports of instances between machines. There's like a lot of things in there that are not new features, but that are very good quality of life improvements that are all in this release. All right, let's go and look at those features now. The first is TrueNAS. So for that, I need a TrueNAS. Hey, I've got a TrueNAS. So this is, this is pre-release TrueNAS. I'm not sure if it shows that. Yeah, 2510, master build, GoldEye, something. It's not been updated in a little while. There's some updates available. Doesn't really matter. It's actually running in a VM, so that's why we say it's running on an AMD Epic box. It's got 16 gigs of RAM. I've got what do I have for storage? Yeah, storage is running on 50 gigs of storage. And there's currently just one pool called test that's created with effectively nothing on it. I believe I had to do some tweaks on the network side. So for the iSCSI stuff to work, you need to be on static IPs. So I had to do that. And also there's like services somewhere in there. Yeah, services. iSCSI had to be enabled. So anyway, we've got that in place now. And now that we do, we get to use that from Incus. So if I go into terminal, I'm creating a new VM. So I'm going to do Debian 13, TrueNAS demo, VM, just give it some bit of extra CPU and memory. I don't really need to boost the storage because we're not going to use it. So let's go with that. And I'm just gonna install the latest stable release of Incus in there and then connect that to TrueNAS. So TrueNAS demo, okay. Need to install curl and then install Incus. All right. And installing Incus stable. There we go. It's actually going to be my first time doing it with the stable packages that include all of the tools needed now to access the TrueNAS API. Up until now, like including in the release announcement, I was manually building the TrueNAS Incus integration tool and running it manually. But the packages now include everything, so it should just work. Okay, so Incus is installed, and we can run it through a normal init, which will just give us a local storage pool and network. So at this point, we just have directory storage pool, and that's it. Now we need to actually connect it to TrueNAS. So first we create a new storage pool. So let's call that my NAS. Let's do that. Okay, there we go. Driver is TrueNAS. The source is the dataset and on the TrueNAS side. So the pool was named test. So let's do test/demo. Okay, then in my case, I don't have it on a valid certificate, so I need to do allow insecure true. And then we need the TrueNAS host itself, so where it's at. In my case, it is TrueNAS01 dot, what network is that thing on? It's default LXC SSH. Let's go on that. I think that's where it is. And lastly, you need an API key. So TrueNAS.API_key that we need to go get in the UI. So if I go on my user, my API keys, there's one there, but you can't get it back. You can only get it at generation time. So I need to delete it, create a new one. Incus demo. There we go, got an API key, and we can put it here. And that failed because of iSCSI. Yeah, I forgot to install that. So we don't automatically depend on anything on it because we don't want the iSCSI services on every machine. But if you want it to work, and that's actually in the documentation, you need to make sure you've got OpenISCSI installed on the machine. So now that we do, run the command again, it should be able to go and create what it wants inside of TrueNAS and connect it. There we go, created. If we go back in the TrueNAS UI, you can see demo was created here, and you've got kind of a normal structure of ZFS datasets that Incus usually generates. That's working. And now here, if I do launch Debian 13 C1 local, this will just create it on the local storage pool. There we go. And if we do C1 NAS and I do storage my NAS, that will instead create it on the TrueNAS server. And so it's doing the same thing. It's a bit slower, mostly because it needs to do a bunch of back and forth with iSCSI to set things up and tear them down kind of constantly during creation. And also because the TrueNAS VM here is a VM running on a server in a different building, and I'm going through Wi-Fi. So not the most ideal situation, but it does work. And once it's actually up and running, it's fine. So you can see here, C1 NAS is now running. And if we go look inside, we can see it's connected from a very long path, which is the iSCSI device. So over IPv6 from the TrueNAS VM running, and then you can see Incus test demo container C1. So that's the actual path within within ZFS on the TrueNAS side, and I can see it allocated 10 gigs for using 411, and that's working just fine. Now if we go look back inside of TrueNAS and we go look at containers, refresh this stuff a bit, I got logged out. Okay, here we go, we can see it's here. So it effectively created that remotely and then created a container from it. And it does do all the copy on write and everything you would normally expect. So the image is here, the container is here. Now if I go and I create another one, so if we do C2 NAS instead, This time it doesn't need to unpack anything. It just tells TrueNAS to do a clone for us and then expose the resulting volume over the network through SCSI. As we can see, it's created quite a bit faster. And then we're booting off from that. All right, so that's for TrueNAS. I think it's going to be quite exciting once this version of TrueNAS actually comes out stable and people can start making use of that. Because for a home lab, it's pretty ideal. You can effectively have your TrueNAS box that acts as your NAS for the whole home. It can run some VMs natively itself through Incus. And if you want more, you can have systems potentially running something like Incus OS. Just connect into that TrueNAS box and run containers or VMs on that network storage. All right. So next up, we've got Windows. So let's go take a look at that. I actually do have a pre-created VM I can show you. So this is, the VM is called Windows 2025, and we can see it with a few things attached. It's got the agent drive. Doesn't really matter until post-install, but eventually I want to run the agent, so I've got the drive attached. I've got the install media, which is the ISO itself, attached as USB. That part is the important part. The disk itself I'm attaching as NVMe because Windows supports that natively and you get good performance, so why not? TPM is attached because newer Windows systems really like it when you do have a TPM. And then I'm also attaching the latest version of the Vatayo drivers over the USB bus too. That effectively lets me install any missing driver, whether it's for network or for anything else, directly from that. And whether it's needed for installation or not. Like I'm installing on NVMe, so I won't need a driver for that. If I didn't install on NVMe, then I would need to use the driver CD-ROM drive to install the storage driver. Anyways, with that done, we can do Windows 25, console VGA. And I didn't decide to, I think the boot order is wrong. Okay, let's just stop that. I didn't actually try it. I mean, I didn't try this particular config. Normally on the install drive, I do a boot priority 10 to make sure that we boot from that and not from anything else. So that should take care of the problem. Here we go, press a new key, and now starting the installer. And so prior to this change, around now, you would get a prompt saying, hey, missing drivers, please load the drivers. And you couldn't actually load anything, and that would be kind of the end of that, unless you were using a repacked ISO. Whereas now, it just started into the installer, no problem. I can select thing, install Windows Server, sure, agree, next. And then can do standard desktop version. And next, sure. Should just detect the drive. It will see it just fine, as we can see here. If it didn't, so if you were using Vatayo SCSI, then you would be able to use load driver. And when doing load driver, you'd be able to go onto the Vatayo Win disk and have it detect the needed driver there. There's no driver needed in this case, so it's fine. But like, for example, we could probably trigger it into loading the network driver at this point. There we go. Doesn't really make, like, it's not needed obviously during the install, but that would mean we have it post-install, so we can do that. It's for installing the driver and then not seeing anything new, but we should have the driver loaded anyways. Then we can do next. And yeah, everything is good, ready to go, install. And now it's going through the install process. One downside of installing from USB is that it's slower than installing from like one of the Vatayo SCSI drives, but on the upside, you don't need to spend time repacking the ISO, which itself takes quite a while. So it might be a worthwhile trade-off to still use USB for the installation, and then post-install, you'll have the proper drivers and can use that. All right, let's leave that one do its thing. It's fine. And just look at the last feature on the list, which is configuring the CLI. So as mentioned, we don't currently have a command line tool to do that. So you effectively do it by editing the config file, which is in .config incus config YAML. And there I've got all of my remotes, all of that stuff. And towards the bottom, I've got this defaults, and then list format, console type, console spice command. As a reminder, like you can use that already to change some other things. So like the list format, I could put compact, and then that changes the default list format. Or I could say, for some reason, I don't like headers, which is no header, I think is the keyword. Yeah, removing the header that way. Or I can do, was it table, no header? And then I get the same table, but without the header line. You could even do some weird stuff like CSV no header. Not really recommended, because not every single list command that you're running is gonna look like this. But you can. Or keep it empty or remove the line if you want the default value. So currently, if we do console on, say, Incus OS here, it's the text console that connects. Now, if we wanted to change that, we can do console type VGA instead, and now it does VGA. So that's the main improvement there. As mentioned, the next one is to customize the spice command itself. We could probably do something like this, which is gonna fail, but it might still gonna prove the point. Yeah, there we go. So now what I've done is, instead of it calling spicy or remote viewer or something like that, it's being told run bin echo and then the placeholder, and we can see it did it just fine here. Now, obviously, it immediately exited in this case, and so the socket is no longer valid. It probably even was deleted from the file system entirely. But if you wanted to do something, either run a different command or run the command with different arguments, you can do it now. So as mentioned, spicy is the one we usually use, at least the one I usually use. So I can do user bin spicy, and then how does it want its thing? Help, so it normally takes URI and then the socket. So I suspect the default config would be this, basically. Yep, that works. Which means now if you wanted to specify extra arguments, there's not a ton really to set in this case, because it's not the most fully featured Spice client ever. I think Remote Viewer has more options. But say you wanted to always make it full screen, you could press -F, and now you can't actually see it because it displayed on the wrong screen. I've got dual monitor set up. So you're gonna have to believe me, but basically it spawned full screen on my other display. I guess something I could do here to show is maybe using the title option instead. So it's --title foo. Now if I run this again, now we can see it sets foo on the title bar. So anyway, we've got those options now. That makes things a bit more flexible. We're likely to add more similar options for the CLI, like to customize kind of default behavior of various aspects of the CLI. And as mentioned, we need to also add another command so you can actually manage that through the CLI itself instead of having to modify the config by hand. All right, let's maybe check what Windows is doing. Windows 25 takes a while to install, so I don't think I'm gonna wait for that to complete, but I just wanted to make sure to check where it's at. 23%, so yeah, it's gonna take a while. I'm not gonna go through the whole thing during this video, but it works. Next, I'm actually doing things slightly out of order here, but the tmpfs and tmpfs-overlay. So let's just take a look at that real quick. For that, I'm gonna need a container. So I'm just gonna create but not start a Debian 13 container. And the create but not start is kind of important here because tmpfs-overlay, they only work at startup time. You can't add them to a running container. So if I did launch, I would need to stop it before I can add those. Now, let's add a couple of devices. So we can add C1, a new device called tmpfs. I want it mounted on MNT tmpfs. Let's put a size of 100 megs on it. And we can do like initial UID 1000, initial GID 1000 initial mode 0700. Oh, I forgot to mention it's a disk device. Let's fix that. Disk. And this country is, oh yeah, and I'm missing the magic source. So the source is tmpfs colon. Can we edit it once? Oh, right. That's interesting. Can be added once the instance is created. Okay, we're going to tweak that your section a tiny bit. So what it's saying is that the initial dot options only work through a profile, which is okay, convenient in this case. Well, convenient in most cases, not convenient in this case. So I'm gonna do it without them, but we're gonna be restricting, like we're gonna be lifting that restriction a bit because tmpfs is new every time you start the instance. So the initial dot configs actually makes sense to set on this one and not just when it's inherited through a profile. Anyways, let's just do simple tmpfs and then do a tmpfs-overlay. I'm gonna put it on /etc. You might be wondering why. That's kind of a weird thing to do, and it is a weird thing to do and probably a bad idea, but it kind of shows the point. And let's do 50 megs on that one. Okay. Now let's start and let's take a look at what we have. Okay, so the container itself doesn't have a limit, so it's got 390 gigs of free space. /etc is now a tmpfs with an overlay, so it shows 50 megs, and we have mount tmpfs, which is 100 megs as configured. Now, mount tmpfs is just a basic tmpfs. Tmpfs foo, so I can write that. And /etc, if you look at it, it will look pretty normal. But if I do the same thing, so if I write hello to etc foo, I can check both of them right now. tmpfs foo, they're both here. If I reboot, we can see I do have some amount of persistent storage because my bash history itself is fine, but etc foo is gone, tmpfs foo is gone. So, I mean, that's the whole point of tmpfs. They're temporary, they're in memory, and we effectively support both just a standard mount, which is like an empty mount point that you can write to, and on reboot it's gone, or we support the combination with overlay fs, which then lets you see normal content and write new stuff to it, but then any changes you make will be lost on reboot. And that's it. That's everything in this release. Just gonna again check Windows, just see if by some magic it's mostly done. I don't think so, but it is at 30-something%. Yeah, it's gonna take a while. All right. Won't get to show you that being installed. It would take way too long. But that's it for Incus 6.16. So as mentioned, not a ton of new features, but some pretty important ones. I think the TrueNAS storage driver will make a bunch of people kind of rethink how they might want to be deploying a small cluster at home, because a lot of people use TrueNAS at home already for storage. This then makes it easy to have some other systems without much storage and then effectively delegate all the storage stuff to TrueNAS itself. You're obviously dependent on your network. So if you just have like a basic gigabit wired network, it might not be the most fun experience if you're running some pretty IO intensive VMs, for example. But if you've got, 2.5 gig, 5 gig, 10 gigs networking, then that's a pretty viable option. Same thing for Windows, being able to just grab an ISO from Microsoft or even another operating system, just attach it to Incus, put it on the USB bus, and things just work. That's quite a nice quality of life improvement compared to having to download, install distro builder, run a separate command, wait for it to download stuff, repack the ISO, and then use that modified file out of it. So quite a better user experience. Really happy we managed to track down the issue and get that working. tmpfs and tmpfs-overlay, that should help quite a lot of OCI container users, because especially the tmpfs plus overlay combo is something that I've never really seen done until looking at what Docker was doing internally in some cases. So having that there should allow more images to kind of work out of the box without needing some fixes and tweaks by just being able to attach a tmpfs overlay on the right folders, and things would just function correctly. And then a bit more CLI configuration. We'll see how far we take this, but it's definitely, for some of those options where there's multiple values, there's no real good default. It's nice to just have extra config options that people can use without having to abuse the CLI alias feature that we have, where you can kind of rewrite specific commands to pass different arguments. This is cleaner, so expecting to see more things being added there. And that's it for Incus 6.16. The Zabli kernel Zabli package repo has already been updated for it. Just one thing to keep in mind, the old signing key, well, the signing key for the repository had an expiry of about a week ago. It got renewed, there's a new version of the key, but there's no way to really roll out automatically. So if you're using the Zabli package repo and you're running apt update and it tells you the repo key has expired, there is a forum post that goes over how to just refresh the key on your system to get the same key but with the new expiry. So it just is the exact same key, it just got renewed for another 5 years. And there are instructions here for like how to check the current key, which would show that it's expired, download the new key on the side, check that it's all fine. The only thing has changed is the expiry, but the key itself is still the same. So there's some instructions for that. And that's it. If you've got any questions about Incus 6.16, feel free to leave them down below or on the community forum, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.